All right, this little lecture is about communities and ecosystems. We've definitely referenced a lot of these concepts throughout the semester, so hopefully you'll be familiar with them. It's just a little bit more kind of all together at this point. Actually, I don't want to do that. So here. Okay, communities and ecosystems. It's chapter 37 in the non-majors book, one of the 50s in the majors. We've definitely spoken about interactions between organisms within a community. So if you remember, community is looking at all the organisms within the environment. Whereas a population, which we had a different lecture on, the population is all the organisms of the same species. So now we're looking at different species and how they're interacting. And this is a great chart, so you'd want to know these different types of interspecific interactions between species interactions. And I really like the pluses and minuses. I think it makes it easy to remember. So competition is going to actually have a negative effect on both parties in the relationship. So competing for resources, competing for mates, although if they're different species, that shouldn't be the case. Mutualism is a positive effect on both organisms. So we've seen that with the plants and the mycorrhizae, the fungal symbiotic relationship with the plants. So both of them benefit, at least we think they do. So plants are going to get increased water and nutrients because of the surface area of the fungi, and the fungi can probably get food in the form of carbon compounds from the plant that's doing photosynthesis. Predation, as you might expect, so predation means something's hunting and eating the other organism. So the organisms that's the hunter, the predator, is positive. The organism that's the prey or getting eaten and hunted, that's going to be a negative effect. Sorry, my computer's being very sensitive. Herbivory, which means eating plants. So predation is hunting animals, eating or organisms that move around. Herbivory is specifically plants. I don't know if fungi count under that, but possibly. But it's the organism that's doing the eating is going to be the herbivore, which is going to have a positive part in this relationship, whereas the organism that's getting eaten, like the leaf, is going to have it's going to negatively impact that species. And parasites and pathogens we've talked about. Parasites are a type of pathogen, but not all pathogens are parasites. So parasites live off the nutrients of the host in some form or fashion. Pathogens just make the organism ill. And they don't have to necessarily eat the host or eat the host food or something like that. So the parasite or the pathogen is going to have a positive effect on that species versus a negative on the species that it is parasitizing or pathogenic in. Remember, our salmonellas are bacteria, heartworms are roundworms, nematodes. So those would be infections that would have a positive-negative relationship. We've definitely discussed trophic factor. So trophic factor is really the feeding relationships. You guys have seen food chains since you were little kids, right? The fish eats the seaweed, the bigger fish eats the littler fish, the orca eats the bigger fish, and it's the top of the food chain, right? So that would be one example of how we do trophic structures. I'll let you guys look at this list on online. It's probably what you already know. I'll just talk about it in this diagram. So we have aquatic food chains and terrestrial, meaning on land. So I guess it would be important for you to know the producers in each of those environments. So on land, the primary producer, meaning first level, gets the energy from the sun and converts that energy into energy in the bonds of food. That's going to be your plants on land, and your phytoplankton in aquatic or in water. And those include your unicellular algae, your small, all your small photosynthetic organisms, cyanobacteria. So this is like a dinoflagellate. That could be a dinoflagellate as well. We have some diatoms in there. The second level are primary consumers, which are organisms that eat the primary producers. So this is going to be herbivores. So the grasshopper is going to eat parts of the flower, so it's a primary consumer. And they don't have to be small. The primary consumers can be like a cow. The zooplankton, which is small, is the organisms that eat the phytoplankton. Like rotifers in here, there's some types of worms. Then we have secondary consumers, which basically are carnivores or omnivores that eat. I guess omnivores can also count in primary if they're eating the plants. So they're going to be carnivores that eat the primary consumer. Tertiary, that means third level, third. They're going to be organisms that eat the secondary consumer animals. And then there's going to be quaternary, which means fourth level. And those are going to be organisms that eat the tertiary animals. And of course, the reason you eat is to get carbon compounds, which have electrons in their bonds. Those electrons can be released during the process of cellular respiration. And the electrons can be moved around in order to make work be done in the form of making ATP, which then, of course, we use ATP to run all the chemical reactions in the body, as well as to do like contractions of muscles and lots of other types of movement. Of course, we know without ATP we die, so you need this. So it's really an energy transfer. I want to emphasize that no one's making energy. It's transferring energy from the sun to the photosynthetic organisms. They convert that sun energy into food energy, chemical energy in the bonds, and then each level here takes that chemical energy and converts it into a different type of chemical energy called ATP. In their body structures themselves, they have carbon compounds, of course, and that's where the next level gets their energy from, is converting the carbon compounds into breaking them down in order to make ATP, and it just keeps going. Really, of course, you know that a food chain is a super simplified version. Most of the time, organisms eat more than one type of producer or more than one type of consumer, not just a one-to-one relationship. And so really we get more pictures like this, and this is probably even simplified, but you see here is our producers. Producers are eaten by a number of different organisms. Okay. Consumers they both are eaten by certain, so like a snake eats both this chipmunk and this mouse. This bird here is going to eat both parts of the plant as well as can eat grasshoppers, insects, and also ants in this case. You can see where the arrows are going, so you can see it's a lot more complicated. And each level ends up having really kind of one or two different organisms on that level. We discussed keystone species in animals, I think, or fungi in the majors class, but let me just remind you, keystone in architecture is this sort of triangle without a top shaped brick, and that's you can make arches like this. Oh, sorry about the train. Without having to use any mortar. And so the reason is because this keystone. So if you take the keystone out, the blocks don't have the right tension sort of anymore, and so they fall down. So that's what we call keystone species, is basically if you take that species out of the environment, everything else falls apart or goes really out of whack. So the sea stars, and then sea urchins, otters. So it's like on both ends. So like the sea star, the food it eats will go out of control if it goes away, and the organisms that eat it will die off if it goes away. And so even though there's not that many sea stars in the environment, they're really keystone species because they're really important for keeping everything balanced. So extinction of keystone species is going to be a major problem in the environment. And remember, it's not necessarily the most abundant, but it's the one who holds a key role in the web. Invasive species sometimes can be one of the reasons keystone species become extinct or dwindle in numbers. Invasive species also displace or outright kill native species that are non-keystone. So an invasive species is an introduced species. So an example is Australia. Rabbits did not live in Australia. They were brought over by settlers, and you can see they started over here just in this one little pocket and have spread throughout the entire, almost the entire continent over time. They take the place of and steal the resources in this case, or they could actually kill the organisms that are already there. They don't usually have natural predators because they haven't co-evolved in the environment. They're just jumping in without having been part of the fabric. And so there's nothing to eat the rabbits. Of course, they're very fast reproducing, and so they just go crazy. Cane toad. Clay told us about that in one class. That's going to be another invasive species in Australia. And you know, sometimes they introduce these species because they're trying to control something else. But then it gets out of control because it's such a delicate balance. It's hard. Like we think about the chytrid fungus we talked about, killing all the amphibians. Well, an idea to control the chytrid fungus would be to introduce another organism, that could kill or eat the chytrid fungus, right? And that should prevent it from infecting amphibians, so amphibian populations shouldn't be dying off like crazy. The problem is the introduced species may or may not do what you think it's going to do, so it may attack and eat other fungi, and that could throw off the environment. It might not eat the chytrids at all, but have some kind of other consequence. Something else might eat it, and then that population would get really large. So it's really a dangerous but sometimes necessary situation to try to go in and alter the environment by introducing new species. And that's also, plants are a huge problem as well. There's the cane toad. I don't have a picture of a plant, but they can take over environments like crazy and basically take so many resources that the other organisms can't survive. And that's why they're so particular at airports with customs, that they could take away any kind of fresh food you have or anything, even if you bought it in the airport in the other countries, because they're really trying to prevent invasive species from getting from place to place, like West Nile being carried by those mosquitoes. That's introduced. That's not really invasive per se, but it's the same sort of idea as being introduced species. So just because they throw away your apple doesn't mean you should be annoyed with them. They're just trying to prevent devastation to the ecosystem. That's okay. Just when we look at energy flow through the system, So our ecosystem, right, is the animals, or all the organisms really, which are plants and animals, fungus, and protists, plus all the non-living factors. We call those abiotic, meaning without life. Bio is life, a is without. And so when we look at that, we have two flows, and this is a really important theme for all of biology, is the energy flow and the chemical flow, or chemical cycling. So chemical cycling suggests that it's the molecules are staying within the system, which is true. Whereas energy flow is energy comes into the system and then ends up exiting the system. So here's a picture of a terrarium, and the energy flow is coming in via the light. So that's in our environments where the energy comes in, the solar light energy, that's the constant supply of energy into the environment. Conversion into chemical energy via photosynthesis, chemical energy to other chemical energy via cellular respiration. Chemical reactions release heat energy, and that's basically how the energy exits the system. So you see that's in and out. Chemical elements cycle. So this is going to be all your molecules, all your atoms. They cycle through. So you're going to have living organisms that then die or get eaten, and they get broken down by bacteria, protists, fungi, earthworms, all kinds of things like that. And then eventually they get built back up into the plants. And then those plants get eaten. The carbons and hydrogens, nitrogens, oxygens, all that gets transferred to the next organism, builds its body, transferred to the next organism, builds its body, and keeps on cycling around. We also have some of the elements going into water and carbon dioxide and oxygen. And all those molecules are released or incorporated during photosynthesis and cell respiration, and so that cycles as well. Like the CO2 that we breathe out, plants take in, they build into carbon compounds, food molecules, which then other organisms eat, or they use themselves. They break it back down into CO2 and it goes back into the environment. So it's a big cycle. The base of the cycle, of course, the light energy has to come into the system, and that's through these primary producers. And there are certain environments that the primary production is massively more than almost everywhere else. So you see the coral reefs and algal beds in the aquatic systems is going to be really where you get most of your biomass, meaning all your organic material. So the CO2 being taken from the air and made into food molecules, that's the coral reefs. And the tropical rainforest in the terrestrial, the green is the on land. They're going to be really where that's occurring. Estuaries are also very high in biomass production. And unfortunately, tropical rainforests and coral reefs are where we're having a lot of devastation going on. And so that's knocking out these primary production hotbeds, if you will. And so this is going to be a big issue, because the carbon cycling is not, carbon's not getting taken out of the atmosphere because these populations or these ecosystems are dying. Well, okay. In food chains, you'll probably notice there's only about 4, maybe 5 levels of consumption. You don't have like the 10th level of organism in the food chain. And that's really because every time an organism eats another organism, it can't access a large portion of the energy from that other organism. So in other words, every level you go, you get only 10% of the last level. So producers have they can, if there's, this is energy units, kilocalories are energy. And really, kilocalories are the calories you see on the back of packets of food. So if the sunlight is providing 1 million kilocalories of energy, the plants can convert that into 10,000 kilocalories. Primary consumers like the grasshopper, 1,000 kilocalories. The mouse only gets 100, and the snake only really gets 10. So you see, you have to have a lot more producers in order to support the consumers, because the efficiency of transfer of energy in those carbon bonds is not very high. So if you think about it, vegetarians and or just eating more plants rather than animals is actually energetically favorable, because the same amount of corn, if the people are eating the plant, the producer, then they can get 10% of that energy. Whereas if you're eating the meat that the producer or that the primary consumer has eaten, you only get 1% of that corn energy. So this is, it's also very economically, environmentally expensive to have meat. So the grazing of the meat organisms or the fishing of them or whatever takes a lot of land and can be hard to balance, like overfishing. And also, you have to eat a lot more of it in order to get the same access to the same amount of kilocalories. Which is not to say everyone should become a vegetarian at all. It's just to say, realize that you have less of an impact on the environment, and if you can just shift to some more fruits and vegetables. And it's also obviously very good for you to eat those kinds of foods on a large quantity on a daily basis. Biogeochemical cycles, so bio meaning life, geochemical meaning like abiotic or chemical compounds in the earth. So biotics, all the living, these organisms here, these guys. Abiotic is going to be these boxes. And there are certain spots where we store all the abiotic molecules. And geological processes are going to do that. So that's like when we have our fossil fuels come from abiotic resources. And so that's because you see, what would happen is that you'd have plants, let's say coal. So you'd have ferns in the Carboniferous period, producers, they get broken down by decomposers into carbon compounds, which again gets stored underneath the ground in abiotic reservoirs, which would just kind of go in a geological circle. But if we tap into them, it doesn't go back into this cycle, but it goes out here. And so basically we're tapping into an abiotic reservoir that may or may not be ready to be released in the sense of contribution of molecules to the atmosphere. It's like prematurely exposing them. So this would be the bio part, and so you can see lots of interconnections there. And this is going to be nutrients, phosphates, the nitrogen, the calcium and small molecules like that, or ions really. It's going to be your carbon compounds, your water cycle, all those things. And then I just wanted to talk about this process called eutrophication. You can see it more detailed on these last two slides, but I'll just talk about it here. It's actually a big problem in Texas directly, like on the Gulf. And then within communities themselves, particularly with standing water. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So what eutrophication means is that it's algae, possibly plants, like lily pads or something. It's an aquatic environment, but frequently algae, sometimes cyanobacteria, those photosynthetic bacteria, and they bloom, or they grow out of control. And they form like pond scum. That's all single cellular green algae. And the reason they can bloom like that is because of increased nutrients in the environment. So sometimes increased nutrients could be due to natural processes like breakdown. But nowadays we have lots of increased nutrients from human activities like phosphates, increased phosphate levels due to fertilizers, pesticides, treatment, sewage treatment facilities, or animal wastes from feedlots, meaning like where you're raising the animals. So all those have lots of phosphate in it. You have the same thing with the nitrogen cycle, or the nitrogen contribution as well. And so what would happen is that it seems like it would be a good idea to have more nutrients in the environment, but when that happens, the bloom occurs, the algae basically uses up its resources and dies, and when it's being decomposed by the microorganisms, they're consuming tons of oxygen, the little bacteria, and it depletes the oxygen from the actual water itself. So this pond here, the fish in the pond won't have enough oxygen in the water to live, and so they'll die or be displaced if they have somewhere else to go, and then that kind of really ruins the environment. You can also have a problem besides the oxygen being depleted, is also with blocking out sunlight, and so photosynthetic organisms underneath this level here can't get light, so they can't do photosynthesis, so they die, and then anyone that depends on them die as well. And these kinds of things lead to what we call dead zones. So you see increase during summer months. In the Gulf of Mexico, the dead zone here is in the red, and all the agricultural things from fertilizers in agriculture, as well as the animals, their runoff, processing plants, it comes down the Mississippi and dumps into the Gulf of Mexico, and increases the nutrients. The blooms happen there. The algal blooms decreases the oxygen content in the water, and then all the organisms can't live there. We call it a dead zone. So they have to move out or they die. So we'll really see shifting fish populations. And then, of course, if the fish shift, then the other organisms that eat the fish have to shift. And then it basically changes the distribution of the organisms. Okay, so that's basically the ideas about the ecosystems and communities. And I guess also that's why when you get pond scum like crazy, you'll see sometimes they'll come and scrape it all off, or the lily pads all over the pond, they'll come pull them out. And that's why they don't want the eutrophication to occur, or it has. They don't want it to have the impact on the environment where it kills all the organisms in the lake because depletion of oxygen.